She always believed she was born to lead. From the moment she entered a room, people noticed her. Her walk, her tone, even the way she held her coffee cup. Everything about her showed confidence. She was the kind of woman who seemed to have everything figured out. People admired her, some feared her, but no one ever dared to challenge her. Her name was Lena. She worked in a busy marketing firm in the heart of the city. Every morning she arrived early, heels clicking sharply on the office floor. Her desk was always neat, her laptop perfectly centered, her coffee made exactly how she liked it. To her team, she was a perfectionist. To herself, she was powerful. She didn't just do her job, she owned it. Her voice carried authority in meetings, and everyone listened when she spoke. She had built her career through hard work and discipline. Late nights, endless presentations, and missed weekends were all part of her success story. But more than her talent, it was her control over people and situations that gave her satisfaction. She liked when others depended on her decisions. It made her feel untouchable. Her colleagues respected her, but they also whispered about her behind closed doors. They said she was cold, that she cared more about winning than people. Lena didn't mind. She used to tell herself that softness was a weakness. If you want to rise, she often thought, you can't let emotions slow you down. There was one young employee in her department, a quiet man who made small mistakes often. One morning, he forgot to attach a file before sending an important email to a client. It was a small slip, but Lena turned it into a public lesson. She called him out in front of everyone. Her words were sharp, her tone colder than ice. The room went silent. The man lowered his head, embarrassed. Lena felt no guilt. In her mind, she was teaching him discipline. Later that day, when one of her co-workers told her she might have gone too far, she replied simply, "If he can't handle pressure, he's in the wrong place." That was who she was. Strong, successful, unbothered. Outside work. Lena lived alone in a modern apartment that looked like something out of a magazine. Everything was perfect. Polished floors, elegant furniture, expensive candles she rarely lit. But despite the beauty around her, the space felt quiet, almost too quiet. She often told herself she didn't need anyone. She was proud of her independence. She didn't rely on friends or family much, and she didn't like emotional conversations. When people around her cried or broke down, she froze. She wasn't good at comfort. Her strength was logic, not feelings. But sometimes, late at night, when the city lights flickered outside her window, she wondered if something was missing. She would scroll through her phone, seeing photos of friends at dinners, weddings, family gatherings, and she would feel an unfamiliar emptiness. Then she'd quickly push it away, convincing herself she didn't have time for such things. Success came with sacrifice, she thought, and loneliness was just part of the price. One Monday morning, her boss announced that their firm had signed a new client, a major community foundation that supported education and social projects. It was a big opportunity, and the company wanted Lena to lead it. She was thrilled. Another challenge, another chance to prove her worth. When the client walked in for the first meeting, Lena's confidence filled the room as always. The woman who entered was older, perhaps in her late 50s. She wore simple clothes, nothing expensive, no designer brand, yet something about her presence was commanding. Her name was Mrs. Noor. She smiled softly, greeting everyone with calm eyes. Lena, used to fast talkers and loud personalities, couldn't quite read her. During the meeting, while others spoke in numbers and strategies, Mrs. Noor listened quietly. Every now and then she would ask a question, not many, but the few she asked were sharp and meaningful. It was clear she understood more than she showed. Lena presented her ideas with her usual confidence. Her slides were polished, her words smooth. She expected the client to be impressed. Most people usually were. But when she finished, Mrs. Noor looked at her and said gently, "Your plan is perfect, but it feels like it was written for success, not for people." The comment caught Lena off guard. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The room was silent. Then she forced a smile and replied, "Success is for people. Without results, you can't help anyone." Mrs. Noor nodded slowly and said, "Maybe, but results without hearts rarely last." Lena didn't like that answer. It felt like a lesson, and she wasn't used to being taught. After the meeting, she told her assistant, "She's kind, but she doesn't understand how business works." Her assistant didn't reply, just nodded politely. Over the next few days, they worked closely with the foundation. Lena noticed that everyone treated Mrs. Noor with unusual respect, not because of her title, but because of how she made them feel. When she entered a room, conversations softened. When she spoke, people listened, not out of fear, but admiration. It was quiet power, the kind Lena had never seen before. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that calmness was not power, it was passivity. "She's too gentle," she told a colleague. "In my world, that doesn't work." But deep down, she was curious. One afternoon, as they prepared for another client presentation, one of Lena's team members made a mistake in the data sheet. The numbers were off, and it almost caused a delay. Lena felt her temper rise. She started to raise her voice, ready to make an example again. But just then, Mrs. Noor entered the room. She placed a hand lightly on Lena's arm and said softly, "It's all right. Mistakes are part of learning." Her tone wasn't commanding, yet it stopped Lena completely. The room went silent. The young team member looked at her with wide eyes. For a moment, Lena didn't know what to say. She wanted to argue, to explain that discipline was necessary. But something about the calm in Mrs. Noor's voice made her pause. It wasn't weakness. It was peace. That night, Lena couldn't stop thinking about that moment. Why did that woman's words affect her so much? She tried to brush it off, but the image of that calm face stayed with her. There was something unsettling about someone who didn't need to raise their voice to be heard. Days passed and Lena continued her work as usual, but she noticed small changes in herself. She began to observe people more, how they reacted, how they felt. She started realizing that her team worked better when she was patient, not strict. She hated to admit it, but it was true. One evening, after a long day, she sat on her balcony with a cup of tea and looked at the city lights. For the first time in years, she thought about her life not in terms of success, but meaning. She had everything she once dreamed of: money, respect, independence, and yet something inside her felt heavy. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her boss. "Good job today. The client appreciates your work. She said she sees potential in you. Real leadership potential." Lena stared at the screen for a long time. Real leadership potential. What did that mean? She was already a leader, wasn't she? Or was she just someone people followed out of fear? The question stayed in her mind as she went to bed. That night, she dreamed she was standing on a high mountain, shouting orders to people far below. Her voice echoed, but no one seemed to hear her. Then, in the dream, Mrs. Noor appeared, standing quietly at the foot of the mountain, surrounded by people who listened to her even in silence. Lena woke up in a cold sweat. The next morning, she looked at herself in the mirror longer than usual. She saw the same confident face, the same sharp eyes. But now there was something else, a trace of doubt. As she got ready for work, she couldn't shake off the thought that maybe power wasn't what she always believed it to be. Maybe control wasn't strength. Maybe there was another kind of power, one that didn't come from commanding others but from understanding them. But Lena wasn't ready to accept that yet. Not now. She brushed off the thought, picked up her bag, and left for another busy day at work, unaware that her journey toward discovering real power had already begun. The days at the office became busier as the project with the foundation moved forward. Everyone seemed excited to be part of it. For Lena, it was another chance to show what she could do. But no matter how much she worked, she couldn't stop thinking about the older woman's quiet strength. Something about it bothered her. Not in a bad way, but in a way she couldn't explain. It made her question herself, and Lena didn't like questions that had no clear answers. She continued to work as she always did, organized, focused, and demanding. But things started to shift in small ways. Her team members began communicating more with the foundation staff than through her. They said it was easier, more peaceful. Lena noticed it, but didn't comment. Deep down, it made her feel uneasy. She had always been the center of every project, the one people looked up to for direction. Now it seemed they were looking elsewhere. One afternoon, as she reviewed the latest campaign designs, her assistant came running in, pale-faced. "The client's report has an error," he said nervously. "The numbers we sent out don't match the data." Lena felt her stomach twist. She grabbed the report and checked the figures. He was right. The numbers were completely off. It wasn't a small mistake this time. It was a big one. For a moment, Lena couldn't breathe. This project was supposed to be perfect, her chance to prove her worth again. Now, everything was at risk. She stood still, her hands trembling slightly, though she quickly hid them behind her back. "Who checked this before it was sent?" she asked sharply. The assistant lowered his eyes. "I did, but I didn't notice." "Didn't notice?" She cut him off. Her tone was sharp enough to make him flinch. "Do you even understand how serious this is?" Before she could continue, her phone rang. It was the company director asking her to attend an emergency meeting with the foundation. Lena's heart raced. She straightened her jacket, told her team to stay calm, and walked out of the office. Her face looked confident, but inside she was panicking. When she entered the meeting room, the air was heavy. Her boss sat at one end of the table, the foundation team at the other. Mrs. Noor was there too, calm as always. She smiled faintly when Lena arrived, as if nothing was wrong. The discussion began immediately. The foundation's finance officer explained the error, and the company director apologized. Lena waited for her turn, ready to defend herself, to explain how hard her team had worked, and how this was a one-time mistake. But before she could speak, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Noor looked around the room and said softly, "It's all right, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we fix them." Lena froze. She expected anger, blame, maybe even threats of canceling the project. But there was none of that. Instead, the older woman's calmness seemed to wash over everyone. The tension in the room eased. Her voice had the kind of power that didn't come from authority but from peace. After the meeting, Lena stayed behind to apologize personally. "I take full responsibility for the error," she said quickly. "It won't happen again." Mrs. Noor smiled gently. "I know," she said. "You're very capable, but you don't have to carry everything alone." Lena frowned slightly. "That's my job. I'm responsible for everything that happens under me." "That's leadership," Mrs. Noor replied, "but it's not power." Lena didn't understand. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Noor looked at her for a long moment before saying quietly, "Power isn't about control, my dear. It's about peace. You can't lead people if they fear you. You can only lead them when they trust you." Lena didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. She wanted to argue, to say that fear gets things done faster, that emotions slow progress. But the calm confidence in the older woman's eyes stopped her. She just nodded awkwardly and left the room. That evening, back at her apartment, Lena sat on the couch in silence. The city noise outside felt distant. She thought about the meeting, about how everything could have gone wrong but didn't, all because of one woman's calmness. She couldn't deny it anymore. Mrs. Noor had a kind of influence that didn't need to shout. People listened to her, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The thought bothered Lena more than she expected. She had spent her whole life believing that strength came from control, from being unshakable, from never letting anyone see weakness. Yet today, she had seen someone who was powerful without any of that. For the next few days, she kept her distance. She focused on fixing the project and making sure nothing went wrong again. But every time she saw Mrs. Noor in the office or during calls, she felt a strange pull, a mixture of admiration and discomfort. One day, while reviewing documents, Lena overheard two of her team members talking quietly near the window. "She's so kind," one of them said. "I've never met someone like her. She makes you want to do your best just by believing in you." They were talking about Mrs. Noor. Lena pretended not to hear, but their words stayed in her mind. She had always thought people respected her because she was competent. Now she wondered if maybe they had only followed her because they were afraid of disappointing her. That thought hurt more than she expected. A week later, the company organized a community event in partnership with the foundation. It was held in a small town on the city's edge, a place Lena had never been before. Children ran around laughing. Families gathered to receive supplies, and volunteers worked together under the warm afternoon sun. Lena watched from a distance as Mrs. Noor moved through the crowd, talking to people, hugging children, listening to everyone with genuine attention. There was no arrogance, no distance. and yet people looked at her with admiration and love. That was power, the kind Lena had never known. At one point, a little boy tripped and scraped his knee. He began to cry loudly. Lena froze, unsure what to do. But before anyone else could react, Mrs. Noor knelt beside him, cleaned the wound, gently, and spoke to him in a calm voice until he stopped crying. The boy smiled again, holding her hand. Something inside Lena shifted. Watching that moment, she felt her throat tighten. It wasn't pity. It was realization. She had spent her entire life proving she was strong, but she had never given anyone that kind of comfort. She had inspired fear, not peace. Later that evening, as the event ended, Lena walked up to Mrs. Noor. "You're very good with people," she said, almost reluctantly. Mrs. Noor smiled. "I just listen to them." "That's not easy," Lena said quietly. "It's easier when you stop trying to be the strongest person in the room," the older woman replied gently. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is care." The words hit Lena deeply. She didn't reply. They drove back to the city in silence, but her mind was far from quiet. The next morning, Lena arrived at work early, as always, but something was different. When her assistant walked in, she greeted him kindly instead of jumping straight into instructions. The man looked surprised but smiled back. It was a small moment, but it felt strange to her, and right at the same time. Throughout the day, she found herself noticing the people around her more. The tired look on her designer's face, the nervousness in her new intern's hands, the quiet sigh of her assistant after a long call. She saw things she had never bothered to see before. That night, while looking through her project notes, Lena caught herself smiling slightly. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything. But she also felt something else. Uncertainty. Change was uncomfortable. She had built her whole identity on being powerful, and now she wasn't sure what that even meant. The following week, the project's final presentation was scheduled. It was their chance to show the results of months of work. The office buzzed with energy, but Lena felt strangely calm. When the day came, she stood before the audience with her team, presenting confidently but with a softer tone than usual. She gave credit to her team, something she rarely did before. When the presentation ended, there was a warm round of applause. Her boss smiled proudly, and Mrs. Noor looked at her with quiet approval. After everyone left, Lena stayed back for a moment, standing alone in the empty room. She looked out the window, watching the city below. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to celebrate or show off. She just felt peaceful. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. She was changing, but she didn't fully understand how or why. Something told her that the real test of power, the kind she had just begun to glimpse, was still waiting ahead. And soon she would find out exactly what that meant. Lena thought things were finally falling into place. The project had gone well, her boss seemed pleased, and even the client had praised her work. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. But peace, as she was about to learn, can disappear faster than it arrives. A few weeks after the successful presentation, her company took on another campaign, a massive one for an international brand. Lena was chosen to lead it again. It was the kind of project that could open doors to even higher positions. She threw herself into it completely, working long hours, sleeping late, skipping meals. The old version of her, the perfectionist, the one who demanded control, started to resurface. She told herself she had learned to be patient, but the pressure began to tighten around her like a rope. One night, she was sitting in her office surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups when her phone buzzed. It was a message from her assistant. "Data issue again. We may have a delay in the client reports." Lena's heart dropped. "Not again." She immediately called him. His voice on the other end was shaky. "I'm so sorry. I think one of the files didn't update before sending. I'll fix it now." Lena felt the heat rising in her chest. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything. Then, trying to control her tone, she said, "Come in early tomorrow. We'll sort this out." She hung up before he could reply. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Her mind was racing. She couldn't afford another mistake. Not after how much she had grown. Not after finally earning respect for more than just being tough. She sat there until midnight, rechecking everything herself. The next morning, the office was tense. Everyone could feel Lena's stress before she even spoke. When her assistant arrived, she gave him a tired smile instead of shouting. "Let's fix this together," she said quietly. But inside, she felt like she was walking on thin ice. As the day went on, more issues appeared. The design team missed a deadline, and one of the senior staff members called in sick. The pressure kept building. By afternoon, Lena could barely keep her calm. She wanted to scream, but she remembered the last time she lost her temper and how it had left a mark on her. She swallowed the anger, but it burned inside. By evening, she was exhausted. When she finally got home, she sat on her couch, staring blankly at the wall. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was from her boss, reminding her about the client review meeting scheduled for the next day. She rubbed her forehead. "Just one good night's sleep," she whispered to herself, "and tomorrow will be fine." But tomorrow wasn't fine. The client meeting turned into a nightmare. The presentation file that was supposed to be perfect wouldn't open. The backup drive didn't load either. Everyone sat there waiting while Lena's heart pounded in her chest. Her boss glanced at her, confused. The client team whispered among themselves. Lena felt her palms sweating. She had tested everything the night before, and now, in front of everyone, it was all falling apart. After a few tense minutes, the IT staff managed to open the file, but half of the data was missing. Her boss cleared his throat and tried to handle the situation, but the damage was done. The client ended the meeting early, saying they would reconsider their options. When everyone left, Lena sat frozen in her chair. She could hear the sound of her own breathing. She had never failed like this before. Not like this. Later that day, her boss called her into his office. "You've been working too hard," he said gently. "Maybe take a few days off." Lena wanted to argue, to say she could fix it, but her voice wouldn't come out. She just nodded and left the room quietly. She walked out of the office and kept walking, not sure where she was going. Her heels clicked against the pavement, her eyes staring straight ahead, her thoughts spinning. The city lights blurred as she crossed the streets. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. That night, she sat by her window and cried quietly. Not because of the failure, but because she didn't understand what was happening to her. She had built her life around being strong, being perfect, being in control, and now all that was slipping through her fingers. The next day, she received a message from Mrs. Noor. "I heard what happened. Don't be too hard on yourself. Come see me at the foundation tomorrow if you can." Lena hesitated, but something in her heart told her to go. The foundation was calm and peaceful, completely different from her busy office. Children played in the courtyard and volunteers moved around with quiet smiles. When Lena walked in, Mrs. Noor greeted her warmly. "You look tired," she said kindly. Lena forced a small smile. "It's been a rough week." "Tell me," the older woman said, leading her to a bench outside. For a moment, Lena didn't know where to start. But as she spoke, the words just came out. The stress, the mistakes, the feeling of losing control. "I tried to stay calm," she said finally. "I thought I had changed. But it's like no matter what I do, everything keeps falling apart." Mrs. Noor listened silently, her hands resting gently on her lap. When Lena finished, she said softly, "Maybe it's not falling apart. Maybe it's falling into place," Lena frowned. "How can failure be part of falling into place?" The older woman smiled. "Because sometimes life has to take away the things you think give you power, so you can find the ones that truly do." Lena looked away. "I don't know what that means." "It means," Mrs. Noor continued, "that strength doesn't always show in success. Sometimes it shows in how you accept loss. Power isn't in control, it's in peace." Lena stayed quiet. Her heart felt heavy, but her mind was strangely calm. "Come help us tomorrow," Mrs. Noor said suddenly. "Spend a day here. It might give you some answers." The next morning, Lena returned to the foundation. She helped organize food boxes, pack supplies, and assist children with schoolwork. At first, she felt awkward. She wasn't used to doing such simple, humble tasks. But as the hours passed, she found herself smiling more. At one point, an old woman came to collect groceries. Her hands trembled slightly as she thanked Lena. "Bless you, my child," she said softly. Lena felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years. When the day ended, Lena sat on a low wall near the gate, watching the sunset. She realized she hadn't thought about work all day. For once, she wasn't thinking about deadlines, reports, or status. She was just present. Mrs. Noor came and sat beside her. "Feels different, doesn't it?" she asked. Lena nodded. "It does. It feels lighter." "That's because you stopped fighting for control," the older woman said. "Real power doesn't demand. It flows." That night, Lena went home with a quiet heart. She didn't have answers yet, but she had something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Over the next few days, she kept visiting the foundation. She still worked on her office projects, but her approach was changing. She began trusting her team more, asking for their ideas, letting them lead certain parts. To her surprise, the work improved. People seemed happier, more creative. One afternoon, while reviewing the new designs, her assistant said, "You've changed, Lena. You're calmer." She smiled softly. "Maybe I'm just tired of fighting everything." He laughed. "Whatever it is, it's working." That evening, she received an email from the client who had walked away after the presentation. They had decided to return to her firm. The mistake, they said, didn't matter anymore. They wanted to continue the partnership. Lena couldn't believe it. She knew it wasn't luck. It was trust. Later that week, she met Mrs. Noor again to tell her the good news. The older woman smiled and said, "See what happens when you let go of fear? The world listens when you stop shouting at it." Lena laughed softly. "You always make it sound so simple." "It is simple," said Mrs. Noor. "We just make it complicated." That night, as Lena drove home, she looked out at the glowing city lights. They didn't look like symbols of ambition anymore. They looked peaceful, almost alive. For the first time, she realized how much of her life had been spent chasing something she already had inside her: strength, peace, purpose. But deep down, she also knew that her journey wasn't over yet. There was more to learn, more to feel. She had only just begun to understand what real power truly meant. And soon life would test that understanding in ways she never expected. The days at the foundation began to feel like a quiet kind of healing for Lena. What started as a one-day visit slowly became part of her weekly routine. Each time she went there, she discovered something new, not about the place, but about herself. At work, she was still respected, still driven, but her energy had shifted. Her colleagues noticed it. She no longer rushed into rooms giving orders. Instead, she listened more, spoke less, and smiled often. People felt more comfortable around her. They began coming to her not out of fear, but because they wanted to. Her boss once said jokingly, "You've become the calmest person in the storm, Lena. What's your secret?" She just smiled and said, "Maybe the storm was always inside me and I finally learned to quiet it." The foundation played a big part in that change. The building wasn't fancy, and the people working there didn't care about titles or money. They cared about purpose. Lena often watched the volunteers work with pure kindness, never asking for recognition. There was one young woman who spent her evenings teaching children how to read. Another man fixed broken chairs and painted walls without ever mentioning his name on anything. One day, Lena asked Mrs. Noor, "How do you get people to care this much without paying them?" Mrs. Noor chuckled softly. "You can't buy real care. You just inspire it. When people see your heart, they offer theirs." Those words stayed with Lena for a long time. One afternoon, a sudden rainstorm flooded part of the neighborhood near the foundation. The small storage area where food and clothes were kept began to fill with water. Volunteers rushed around trying to move supplies to safety. Without thinking twice, Lena kicked off her shoes and helped. She was drenched within minutes, but she didn't care. She lifted boxes, passed bags, and directed people calmly. At one point, a volunteer slipped and a stack of food packages fell into the muddy water. For a brief moment, everyone froze. The younger version of Lena might have shouted or blamed someone. But now she just smiled and said, "It's fine. Let's save what we can. Things can be replaced, people can't." Everyone looked at her with surprise and admiration. By the end of that day, everyone was soaked, exhausted, and laughing. They had managed to save most of the supplies. As they sat under the porch drinking tea, Mrs. Noor looked at Lena and said softly, "Now you understand power." Lena tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" "You kept people calm when things went wrong," Mrs. Noor said. "You didn't raise your voice. You gave them hope. That's power. The kind that brings peace instead of fear. Lena smiled, but inside her heart was full. She finally understood. The next week, she was invited to speak at a local community seminar organized by the foundation. At first, she hesitated. "I'm not a speaker," she told Mrs. Noor. "You don't have to be," the older woman said. "Just speak from your heart." When the day came, Lena stood in front of a small audience, mostly students, volunteers, and a few business professionals. Her palms were sweating, but she took a deep breath and began. She didn't talk about success or money or leadership like she used to. She spoke about mistakes, about pressure, about the time she believed she had everything under control, and how life showed her she didn't. She talked about losing her sense of peace, and how she found it again through kindness and understanding. As she spoke, she noticed people listening closely, not because she was impressive, but because her words were real. When she finished, the room stayed quiet for a few seconds before everyone began to clap. Several people came up to her later, thanking her for her honesty. That night, as she drove home, Lena thought about how different her life had become. She used to measure power by how loud she could be, how high she could climb. Now she saw power in silence, in patience, in love. But her biggest lesson came a few weeks later. One morning, Mrs. Noor called her with worry in her voice. "One of the families we help is in trouble," she said. "Their house caught fire last night. They lost everything." Lena immediately offered to come. They drove to the small neighborhood where the family lived. The house was gone, just blackened wood and ashes left behind. The mother stood nearby holding her little girl, both looking lost. Without hesitation, Lena went to them. She placed her hands on the woman's shoulders and said, "You're not alone. We'll help you rebuild." The woman burst into tears. Lena hugged her tightly, feeling her shoulders shake. She didn't say anything else. She just held her. Later, they helped gather clothes, food, and temporary shelter for the family. Lena worked quietly the whole day, doing everything she could. As the sun began to set, the little girl walked up to Lena, holding a small burnt toy in her hand. "This is all I have left," she said softly. Lena knelt down and looked at her. "It's okay," she said gently. "You'll have more soon. And you still have your mom. That's what matters most." The girl nodded, and for the first time since the fire, she smiled. That night, as Lena drove home, she cried softly. But these tears weren't from pain, they were from gratitude. She realized that helping someone rebuild their life felt more meaningful than any award or bonus she had ever received. A few days later, her boss called her into his office. "You've been different lately," he said with a small smile. "In a good way. I don't know what changed, but it's making a difference. The whole team seems more connected, more relaxed." Lena smiled. "Maybe I finally learned that leading isn't about being the smartest person in the room." He nodded. "Whatever it is, keep it up." That evening, she went back to the foundation again. It had become her second home. She helped the volunteers organize a charity drive and later sat on the steps watching the children play. Mrs. Noor joined her quietly. "You've changed so much, Lena," she said. "Have I?" Lena asked softly. "Yes," said the older woman. "You used to walk into a room and make people nervous. Now you walk in and people feel safe." Lena smiled faintly. "Maybe I just got tired of being strong all the time." Mrs. Noor looked at her kindly. "You didn't get tired of being strong. You just learned what real strength is." They sat there in silence for a while, watching the children chase each other under the soft orange sky. The sound of their laughter filled the air, and Lena felt an unfamiliar lightness in her heart. Later that night, as she drove home, she thought about how far she had come. She used to live for recognition, for control, for perfection. Now she lived for peace and for people. She finally understood what real power was. It wasn't about how much she could control others, but how much love she could share without expecting anything in return. Weeks passed and the foundation continued to grow. More people joined, more projects started, and the atmosphere was filled with purpose. Lena became deeply involved, often managing programs after work and spending weekends volunteering. One evening, as the volunteers gathered for dinner, a young boy she had helped months ago came up to her and said, "Thank you for believing in me. I want to be like you when I grow up." Lena looked at him, her eyes soft. "Don't be like me," she said with a smile. "Be better." The boy grinned and ran off. As she watched him go, Lena realized something powerful. She wasn't chasing success anymore. She was creating it in others. Later that night, she stood outside the foundation, looking at the stars. The sky was wide and peaceful. She thought about her journey, the long path from control to compassion, from power to peace. And for the first time, she truly felt free. Months had passed since Lena had started spending her evenings at the foundation. What began as a distraction from her busy life had slowly become something she couldn't imagine living without. Every day there taught her something new, not just about the world, but about herself. The city was changing with the seasons. Trees shed their old leaves, making space for new ones, and in a strange way, Lena felt the same. She had shed her old version, the one that wanted to control everything, the one that believed power came from having authority, the one that was always afraid to show weakness. Now she smiled more easily. She listened with care. People came to her not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Her co-workers at the company began to notice it more clearly. They started handling problems together instead of waiting for her instructions. Meetings became less about pressure and more about purpose. Even her boss had grown more relaxed around her. But the biggest change was inside Lena. The constant heaviness in her chest that she used to carry for years had disappeared. She no longer woke up anxious about the day ahead. She felt steady, almost peaceful. One quiet afternoon, as she was organizing donations at the foundation, Mrs. Noor came to her holding a letter. "This came for you," she said with a small smile. Lena looked surprised. "For me, here?" "Yes," said Mrs. Noor. "Someone must have noticed how much time you spend here." The envelope had no name on it, just the word "thank you" written neatly on the front. Inside was a short note. It read, "Your kindness changed more lives than you know. Don't stop shining your light." Lena read it twice. Her eyes softened and she folded the note carefully. She didn't know who had written it, but it didn't matter. The words touched something deep inside her. That night she sat alone in her apartment thinking about her journey. The years she had spent climbing ladders, fighting to be seen, demanding control, and the quiet shift that had happened since she started serving others. She realized something profound. Real power wasn't about standing above people. It was about standing with them. As the weeks went by, Lena became more involved with the foundation's new projects. One of them was to build a small learning center for children who didn't have access to schools. It was an ambitious plan, and everyone was nervous about funding. But Lena had faith. She began reaching out to her corporate contacts asking for small donations. To her surprise, many of them said yes. They trusted her. Some even volunteered to help. It was like her calm, sincere energy had begun to ripple outward, touching people without her realizing it. During one of the meetings about the project, a young volunteer said, "You know, we should name the learning center after Mrs. Noor." Everyone agreed immediately. But Mrs. Noor shook her head and said gently, "No names. Let it just belong to the children." Lena smiled at her. "You never want credit for anything, do you?" Mrs. Noor laughed softly. "Real work doesn't need a name on it, my dear. It just needs a heart behind it." Lena admired her deeply for that. She had met so many people in her career, strong, intelligent, successful. But none had inspired her like this quiet woman who didn't care about recognition. A few months later, the learning center opened. The small building was bright and filled with laughter. Children ran around excitedly, holding new books and crayons. Parents stood nearby, smiling with gratitude. It was a day of joy, but also a quiet kind of pride for Lena. When she stood there watching the children read and play, she realized this was one of the most meaningful moments of her life. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just peaceful and real. As the ceremony ended, one of the little girls walked up to her, holding a handmade card that said, "Thank you for giving us a place to learn." Lena knelt down and hugged her gently. "Thank you for reminding me what's important," she whispered. That night she went for a walk by herself. The city lights glowed softly and the air felt cool. She stopped by a small park and sat on a bench, thinking about how different she was from the person she used to be. There was a time when she thought power came from being right, from having people listen to her, from being the one in control. But life had quietly shown her that real power had nothing to do with control. It came from love, from kindness, from humility. As she sat there, she remembered something her father used to tell her when she was young. The strongest trees bend with the wind, he'd say. If they try to resist too hard, they break. Back then, she never understood what he meant. But now she did. She had spent years resisting, fighting every challenge, pushing every obstacle, trying to prove her worth. And in doing so, she had forgotten how to bend, how to breathe, how to let go. Now she was learning to bend. And that had made her stronger than ever. A few days later, she got a call from her company's headquarters. The regional director wanted her to lead a major international project. It was the kind of offer that could push her career to the next level, the kind of opportunity she would have once jumped at without hesitation. But this time she felt something different. She didn't feel the same hunger for it. She thanked them for the offer and asked for a few days to think. That evening, she went to the foundation again. The children were playing outside and the volunteers were laughing over tea. Mrs. Noor noticed the thoughtful look on her face. "Something's on your mind," she said gently. Lena nodded. "They want me to lead a big project overseas. It's a huge opportunity, but I don't know if it's right for me anymore." Mrs. Noor smiled knowingly. "What does your heart say?" Lena thought for a moment. "My heart says I've already found what I was looking for." "Then you have your answer," said Mrs. Noor. "When the heart is at peace, you're already where you're meant to be." Lena smiled softly. The decision felt clear now. She realized she didn't want to go back to that old world. The endless race, the pressure, the loneliness. She wanted to keep doing what gave her peace, what made her feel alive. The next day, she politely declined the offer. Her boss sounded surprised, maybe even confused, but he respected her decision. "You seem happier now," he said before hanging up. "I hope you keep that whatever you do." Lena thanked him, feeling light inside. Over the following months, she continued working both at her job and the foundation. Slowly, the two worlds began to blend. Her company started supporting the foundation's education projects, and several of her colleagues began volunteering on weekends. It was as if her transformation had inspired others to look beyond themselves too. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Lena and Mrs. Noor sat outside the foundation watching the children draw on the pavement with chalk. "You've come a long way," Mrs. Noor said softly. Lena smiled. "I used to think power was about being unshakable," she said. "Now I think it's about being gentle but still standing strong." Mrs. Noor nodded. "Real power doesn't shout. It heals." They sat there in silence for a while, just listening to the laughter of the children echoing in the warm air. Later that night, when Lena returned home, she took out the letter she had received months ago, the one that said, "Don't stop shining your light." She smiled as she read it again. Then she placed it in her journal, next to a page where she had once written, "Power is not control. It's compassion." She closed the book and looked out her window at the city lights below. Somewhere in that big, busy world, she knew there were still people chasing power, the kind she once did. She hoped they would one day find what she found. A few weeks later, during a small celebration at the foundation, the children surprised Lena with a handmade board. It had colorful drawings and a single line written across the top. "You showed us kindness is power." She felt tears fill her eyes as she read those words. In that simple sentence, everything she had learned over the past year came back to her. That night, after everyone left, she stood alone in the quiet room. She looked around. At the walls covered in art, at the shelves stacked with books, at the floor where little feet had danced all evening. She whispered softly to herself, "This is what real power looks like." She turned off the lights and stepped outside. The night air was cool, the sky clear. She walked slowly down the street, her heart full. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. She didn't need to win or lead or control. She just needed to be, and that was enough. As she reached the end of the street, she looked back once more at the foundation building glowing softly in the moonlight. A small smile crossed her face. She had thought she was powerful once. But only now, after meeting real power, the power of kindness, of peace, of love, did she truly understand what it meant to be strong. And with that, she walked into the quiet night, free and whole at last.